I dragged my body toward the front door, leaving a trail of sweat and soot behind me. My lungs were screaming for air that didn't exist. I reached up and grabbed the brass handle. It was scorching. It burned my skin, but I didn't let go. I twisted it. It didn't move. I pulled. Nothing. That's when I saw him through the narrow glass pane. Julian, my husband. He was standing on the porch, just inches away. He wasn't calling 911. He wasn't looking for a rock to break the glass. He was standing there, perfectly still, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the flames. I pounded on the glass with my raw, bleeding knuckles. I screamed his name until my throat felt like it was tearing. He leaned in. His eyes met mine. There was no fear in them. There was no regret. He slowly reached out his hand, gripped the deadbolt, and turned it. Click. The sound was louder than the fire. He had just locked me in my own coffin. Then, he did something that will haunt me forever. He smiled. It was a calm, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who had finally finished a long day of work. He turned his back, stepped off the porch, and walked into the night without a single look back. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He thought Sloane was dead. Before I tell you how I survived that nightmare, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell these stories of justice. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from today? Tell me your city or country in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the night my life turned to ash. My name is Sloane. For a long time, I believed I was living a dream. I was married to Julian, a man the whole town admired. He was a brilliant architect. He was charming, tall, and always knew exactly what to say to make people feel important. When we married 10 years ago, I thought I had found my soulmate. We built a life together that looked perfect from the outside. We had a beautiful home on the edge of a quiet forest. It was a modern house, full of glass and expensive wood. We had dinner parties. We went on vacations. I felt safe. I felt loved. But looking back, the signs were always there. I just chose not to see them. Julian liked things to be a certain way. He picked out my clothes. He decided which friends we would see. He handled all the money. At the time, I thought he was just taking care of me. I thought he was being a strong husband. I didn't realize he was slowly erasing who I was. I was becoming a ghost in my own life long before the fire ever started. The trouble really began about 2 years ago. Julian started coming home later and later. He said work was busy. He said he was designing a major new complex downtown, but he became short-tempered. He stopped looking me in the eye. When I tried to talk to him about our day, he would just stare at his phone. The warmth in our home was replaced by a cold, heavy silence. I tried to fix it. I cooked his favorite meals. I tried to be the perfect wife he wanted. It didn't matter. One afternoon, a man came to the door while Julian was out. He was wearing a cheap suit and looked very tired. He handed me a folder. He said it was a final notice for the mortgage. I told him he must have the wrong house. I told him my husband handled everything, and we were doing very well. The man just shook his head. He told me the bank hadn't seen a payment in 6 months. That was the first time the mask slipped. When Julian came home, I showed him the papers. I expected him to be worried or to explain that there was a mistake. Instead, he turned red. He grabbed the papers from my hand and ripped them up. He screamed at me for snooping in his business. He said I was ungrateful. He said I didn't understand the pressures of his world. For the first time in our marriage, I felt afraid of him, not because of his voice, but because of the look in his eyes. It was like looking at a stranger. After that night, I started looking for the truth. I waited until he was in the shower or out for a walk. I went into his home office. It was a room I was usually forbidden from entering. I found a locked metal box hidden in the back of a closet. I found a key in his sock drawer. Inside that box was the evidence of our ruin. We weren't just behind on the mortgage. We were millions of dollars in debt. Julian had been gambling on risky land deals that went sour. He had emptied my personal savings account. He had even taken out a loan against my grandmother's jewelry. My heart sank as I read the letters. But then, at the bottom of the pile, I found a new document. It was a life insurance policy. It was in my name, Sloane. The policy had been updated only a month ago. If I died, Julian would receive $5 million. I sat on the floor of that dark office and cried. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself he did it to protect me. I told myself he was just desperate. I was so desperate to save my marriage that I stayed. I should have packed a bag and run that very hour. But I stayed. I thought I could talk him through it. I thought we could find a way out together. I didn't realize that to Julian, I wasn't a partner. I was just an asset he needed to liquidate. The night of the fire felt different from the start. Julian came home with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. He was smiling. He was the man I fell in love with again. He told me he was sorry for the stress. He said he had worked out a deal with the bank. He said we were going to be okay. He suggested we have a quiet night in. He cooked a steak dinner. He poured me a glass of wine. I remember the wine tasted a little bitter, but I didn't want to ruin the mood. I drank it. Within 20 minutes, my head began to feel heavy. My vision started to blur. I tried to stand up to clear the table, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I collapsed back into the chair. "Julian," I whispered, "I feel dizzy." He didn't move. He just sat there, watching me with a blank expression. "It's okay, Sloane," he said. His voice was so calm it was chilling. "Just go to sleep. Everything will be settled when you wake up." I tried to fight the sleep. I tried to reach for my phone on the counter, but I couldn't move my arms. I watched him get up. He didn't help me. He walked to the living room. He began to pour something on the rug. It smelled like gasoline. He moved to the curtains and did the same. Then, he took a lighter from the mantel. I watched the first flame catch. It was small at first, a tiny blue and orange flickering light, but it grew so fast. He walked out of the room without looking back. I used every bit of strength I had to roll off the chair. I fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The pain of the impact woke me up just enough to move. I crawled. I crawled through the kitchen as the smoke began to swirl. I reached the hallway. The heat was already intense. It felt like the air was turning into liquid. I reached the front door. I pulled myself up, hoping against hope that I could just walk out. But the door was locked. Not just a regular lock, but the heavy deadbolt that required a key. Julian had taken the key. That was when I saw him through the glass. That was when he smiled. That was the moment I realized the man I loved never existed. He was a monster who had been living in my house for a decade. I fell back to the floor. The smoke was too thick now. I couldn't see my own hands. I felt the heat on my back. I thought about my parents. I thought about the life I would never get to live. I closed my eyes and prayed for it to be over quickly. I didn't want to feel the fire touch me. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of the fire. It was a loud, crashing sound, like a tree falling. Then I felt air. Fresh, cold air hit my face. I felt hands on my shoulders. Big, rough hands. Someone was dragging me. I tried to open my eyes, but the smoke had stung them shut. I felt myself being lifted. I felt the transition from the hot, suffocating house to the cool grass outside. I coughed until I thought my ribs would break. I opened my eyes just a crack. I saw a figure standing over me. They were wearing a bright yellow work vest. I couldn't see their face clearly in the dark. They leaned down and squeezed my hand. "Stay quiet," a voice rasped. It was a deep, gravelly voice. "Don't let him see you." Then the person was gone. They disappeared into the woods behind our house. I did as I was told. I crawled behind a thick row of bushes at the edge of the property. I stayed low in the dirt. A few minutes later, I heard Julian's car come back into the driveway. He jumped out and started screaming. He ran toward the neighbor's house, banging on their door. "Help! My house is on fire. My wife is inside." He was crying. He was wailing. He fell to his knees in the grass, just a few yards from where I was hiding. To anyone watching, he was a man losing everything. To me, he was a murderer performing for an audience. The fire trucks arrived, the street filled with lights and sirens. I watched the firefighters battle the flames. I watched the neighbors hug Julian and give him blankets. No one looked toward the bushes. No one saw me. I knew I couldn't stay there. If the police found me, they would take me to the hospital, and Julian would be right there. He would finish what he started. I waited until the chaos was at its peak. I crawled through the woods, keeping away from the light. I knew these woods well. I walked for 2 miles in the dark, my lungs burning and my skin stinging. I reached a small gas station on the main road. I used the payphone to call the only person Julian had ever been jealous of, my Aunt Martha. Martha was a retired nurse who lived 2 towns over. She never liked Julian. She said he was too polished. She arrived 30 minutes later. When she saw me, she didn't ask questions. She just put me in the back of her car and covered me with a quilt. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in Martha's spare bedroom. She treated my burns. She bought me new clothes. She kept the curtains closed. We watched the news every night. The story was everywhere. Tragic accident claims life of local architect's wife. They showed photos of me. They showed the charred remains of our house. And they showed Julian. He held a funeral. He bought a massive headstone. He gave an interview to the local paper about how he would never love again. He looked so thin and sad. People started a fund for him. They raised $50,000 to help him get back on his feet. It was sickening. But while he was playing the victim, I was playing detective. I had to know who saved me. I knew that yellow vest. I had seen it every other Tuesday for years. It belonged to Silas. Silas was the man who took care of our lawn. Julian treated him like he was invisible. Once, Silas had accidentally clipped a rose bush, and Julian had screamed at him for 10 minutes, calling him lazy and stupid. Silas never fought back. He just lowered his head and went back to work. He was an older man, maybe 60, with white hair and skin that looked like worn leather. He lived in a small trailer park down by the river. I waited until I was strong enough to walk. Aunt Martha drove me to the trailer park. I wore a heavy coat with a hood and a mask. I knocked on the door of Unit 42. When Silas opened the door, he didn't look shocked. He didn't ask who I was. He just stepped back and gestured for me to come in. "I figured you'd come eventually, Sloane," he said. His voice was the same one I had heard in the smoke. We sat at a small kitchen table. He made me a cup of tea. He told me that he had been working late that night on a neighbor's yard. He saw Julian drive up with his lights off. That struck Silas as odd. He knew Julian was a man of habit. He watched Julian go inside. He watched Julian come out 10 minutes later. Silas saw him lock the door, and Silas saw the smile. I knew right then. Silas said, "I saw the flicker in the window. I didn't have a phone on me. I didn't have time to run for help. I just knew I had to get you out." "Why did you leave me in the grass?" I asked. Silas looked down at his hands. "Because I'm a man who's been to prison, Sloane. Long time ago. I knew how it would look. A guy like me at a crime scene. Julian would have pointed the finger at me before the fire was even out. He's a powerful man. I'm just the guy who cuts the grass. I had to get you out and get away." I reached across the table and took his hand. He had risked everything for a woman who had barely ever said more than hello to him. "He's going to get the money in 2 days, I said. "The insurance company is finishing the claim. Not if we have anything to say about it." Silas replied. He pulled out an old laptop. He showed me something I never would have expected. Silas had a hobby. He was a bird watcher. He had set up a high-quality, motion-activated camera in the woods near our property to film a rare owl nest. The camera was hidden in a tree, perfectly positioned to see the side of our house and the driveway. We watched the footage together. It was crystal clear. You could see Julian pouring the accelerant through the window. You could see him standing on the porch. You could see him lighting the cigarette and smiling as I pounded on the glass. It was the smoking gun we needed. The day of the final insurance meeting was cold and rainy. Julian arrived at the lawyer's office in a new car. He was wearing a dark, expensive suit. He looked like a man who was ready to start his new life in Europe. He walked into the conference room with his lawyer. The insurance representative was waiting with a stack of papers. "This has been a very difficult process for everyone," the representative said, "but the investigation is closed. We are ready to issue the check for $5 million. Julian sighed. He rubbed his eyes as if he were holding back tears. "Thank you. It won't bring her back, but it will help me move forward. Sloane would have wanted me to be okay." He picked up the pen. He was seconds away from signing his name. The door to the conference room opened. I walked in first. I had removed my hood. The burns on my neck were visible. a red and angry reminder of what he had done. Behind me walked Silas, carrying the laptop. Behind him were two police officers. The room went dead silent. The pen fell from Julian's hand and clattered onto the mahogany table. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked at me like I was a monster rising from the grave. "Sloane," he whispered. His voice was high and thin. You're dead." "I'm very much alive, Julian," I said. I walked right up to the table and looked him in the eye. "And I remember everything. I remember the wine. I remember the gasoline. And I especially remember the way you smiled when you locked that door." "She's crazy," Julian shouted, turning to the lawyer. "She's traumatized. She doesn't know what she's saying." Silas didn't say a word. He just opened the laptop and pressed play. The room watched the video in total silence. We watched Julian's careful, cold actions. We watched the fire grow. We saw his face in the light of the flames. It wasn't the face of a grieving husband. It was the face of a predator. The insurance representative took the papers back. The lawyer stepped away from Julian, looking at him with pure disgust. The police officers moved forward. Julian tried to run. He pushed over a chair and tried to reach the door. But he was never as strong as he thought he was. The officers tackled him to the ground. As they pulled his arms behind his back and clicked the handcuffs into place, Julian looked at Silas. "You," Julian spat. "You're the one who did this. You're nothing but a gardener." Silas stood tall. He didn't look angry. He looked at peace. "I'm the man who saw you for who you really are, Julian. And I'm the man who saved the life you tried to take." Julian was led away. He was charged with attempted murder, arson, and insurance fraud. The trial was short. The video evidence was impossible to fight. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I didn't take the insurance money. I didn't want a single cent that came from Julian's greed. But I did sell the land where the house had stood. I took that money and I bought a beautiful piece of property for Silas. It has a small, sturdy house and the best garden you've ever seen. He doesn't have to cut anyone's grass but his own now. I moved to a small town where no one knows my name. I live in a house that is warm, but the heat comes from a stove, not a lie. I have scars on my body, and I have scars on my heart. But every morning when I wake up and see the sun through my window, I am grateful. I learned that life can be taken away in a second by the people you trust the most. But I also learned that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear neon work vests and carry a pair of shears. I am Sloane. I survived the fire. And for the first time in my life, I am truly free. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey. It means a lot to be able to tell the truth after being silent for so long. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. It really helps us reach more people. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you found that insurance policy? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay safe, be kind to one another, and I will see you in the next story.